A shocking story for you now. Imagine finding out that your partner was lying to you and it turned out they were an undercover police officer sent to spy on your life.
Yeah, shocking really, but that's exactly what happened to our next guest, Eleanor Fairbraida. She discovered her lover and close friend of 7 years was posing as a committed environmental activist, but was actually a member of the police force sent to infiltrate her friendship group. Worse still, he was a married police officer. He had 2 children.
Now, a new podcast, Undercover, the Spycops, delves into this disturbing story. And Eleanor and podcast creator Andy Whittaker join us now. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Thank you for sharing this story. I actually remember going to a talk about this years ago, and it was jaw-dropping. I couldn't understand why it wasn't big news. Eleanor, you met Kennedy, and you're an environmental activist. Why were they infiltrating your group?
Well, they've been infiltrating progressive activist groups since the 1960s, so starting off with kind of anti-apartheid protesters, women's rights protesters, people who are protesting for things like maternity pay, going through kind of anti-fascist protesting in the 70s, and then sort of culminating in environmental protests. We were campaigning against climate change. So you're right, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why were they infiltrating our group? But our government has basically been sending in police spies and infiltrating activists' lives like this since the 70s. People who are politically active and who are challenging the status quo are basically being infiltrated. They're having files kept on them. The files are kept by Special Branch, and then they're also being kept by MI5.
So can we just go back to the beginning? How did Mark Kennedy, who was the undercover police officer that was spying on your environmental activist group, how did he get in there in the first place? How did he infiltrate your life? I mean, you saw pictures of him there. He doesn't look like an undercover police officer at all. I would think he was an activist, wouldn't you?
They're trained to do it, I guess. They're good at their jobs, right?
Yeah, I mean, they nicknamed themselves the Hairies. They grew their hair. He had tattoos all over him, piercings, and yeah, I mean, he walked into the Sumac Centre, which was a kind of environmental, an activist and community centre in Nottingham, which I was involved in. And just looked like an ordinary person who was interested in trying to make the world a better place, and said, I want to be involved. And being a kind of open community who were trying to get more people involved and do more campaigning, we welcomed him in.
So I'd imagine he went into your group fully loaded with information. He's a professional. He knew what he was doing. How did he work you all over? How did he get in so deep?
He came in and they use a technique called mirroring of basically, saying what you want to hear and saying, I'm into the same things as you are, and particularly around women, they did that. And yeah, he was just keen. He wanted to be involved. He said he'd just moved from London and didn't really have any other friends.
So was it mainly women that were the targets then? Were they easier to build relationships with?
So initially, there weren't any named targets, which is actually a transgression against their own rules. They just targeted the Sumac Centre in a kind of fishing expedition. But yeah, I mean, there was a mixture of when people were named as targets. There were a mixture. But initially, one of the people it's very obvious that Kennedy was targeting was Kate, who became his girlfriend within a few months, and he told her things like, that he lived in the neighbourhood next to her in London, that he supported the same football team as her family supports, that he was really into country and western music, and loved the trailer trash lifestyle because she was living in a caravan on our friend's drive at the time. So,
he was telling her what she wanted to hear.
Exactly, and she kind of felt, I've met someone who's really special, and he did that all the way through with other women as well.
Andy, how often does this happen?
Well, I decided to make this podcast because I thought this story needed more exposure, because I just don't think people know that it happens. The story that I've made is about what Mark Kennedy got up to, and it's a sort of deep dive into what it's like to be infiltrated with people like Eleanor sharing their stories of a part of their life they'd probably really rather forget. And they all opened up to me, and I've got to thank them for that, and shared their stories. So if you listen to the podcast, you get a real kind of in-depth feel for what it's like to have an undercover police officer in your life, in your house, shared a house with Eleanor, in your bed.
Right.
And he wasn't the only one.
And we should point out, like, these these people are professionals, OK? So you can understand how you can get conned by them because, you know,
Yeah.
they're good at what they do, Ellen.
Yeah, and I mean, he had a passport in his undercover name. Like, who else can do that? So, you know, and we just, at the time, we had no idea that this sort of thing happened. Nobody really had any idea that this happened. Like, we understood that the police were interested in what we were doing because we were, you know, committing civil disobedience. We were trying to stop things that we saw that were bad. But we thought it would be phone tapping or potentially undercover officers coming into public meetings and that sort of thing. But to get a phone tap put in your house, it needs to go right up to kind of judicial. You need to get judicial permission to do it, and or even is it to go even higher than that? And yet, so sending undercover.
I think the Home Secretary has to approve a phone tap.
But it's important to separate the two things here, right? The police will feel they're justified investigating criminal offences or what they believed are to be criminal offences, which he's allowed to do with the power of the police force. It's that other stage. It's getting into people's emotions, developing relationships, I guess. Here's where the problems really begin here, right?
Yeah, I mean, you say the police feel they would be justified, but actually what's happened is this is a secret unit that really nobody in the police even know. So the police that Kennedy was meeting as an activist, they didn't know that unit existed and that they were encountering an undercover police officer. He got beaten up by the police while he was an activist, badly beaten up. He had his back broken or fractured in one place or something.
So when he was going on the demonstrations with you, he was getting right into it as well. So that's a bit of an agent provocateur, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly arguments around the fact that he's, you know, evidence of being an agent provocateur. But the public inquiry has recently said that in the interim report in the summer of last year, that if the public had known what was going on about these units, they would have been disbanded in the 1970s. Like these are tactics which shouldn't be used. They've been found in court as being transgressing 5 human rights. Kate's case in the IPT, and it's basically the secrecy around this unit that has kind of enabled it. It's an entire rogue unit, but then it's not really that because it's the MI5 was tasking them for information, so it's coming from the government.
I've got a lot of very important questions that need to be asked about this because you're so right. But the personal effect, Eleanor, and the personal effect on you because your relationship developed, didn't it? Yeah.
So he moved into our house. I lived with him and 3 other people, and then a second house as well. And then I stayed with him in his house afterwards. We were very, very close friends. You know, I knew him for 7 years. Like one of my best friends for 7 years. And in 2008, our relationship developed. We were lovers for a while. But yeah, it's huge.
Just can't imagine that moment, Josie, finding out.
So he went out with your friend, and your friend was the one that actually caught him out in the end, didn't they? They found a passport in his glove box. What was it like when they confronted him?
So my friend Lisa, who had a 6-year relationship with him, and they were kind of lifetime partners. You know, she thought she may be with him for the rest of her life. Like, he was completely integrated in her life. She found his passport. She dug around that, finding out that he was Mark Kennedy and he had children. This was the big thing, that he actually had children. And obviously, having had a relationship for 6 years, you'd think you should know that. But, yeah.
Well, he had 2 children. You were friends with him for 7 years. Your friend also had a relationship with him. Andy, thank you for bringing this to light on your podcast, because they do need to be brought to light. I know some officers that infiltrated these people actually end up having children with the people that were spying on. So thank you so much. We've got a right to reply from the Met now.
Yeah, we have this from the Met Assistant Commissioner Barbara Gray. She said, "We know that enormous distress has been caused as a result of Mark Kennedy's actions, and we've previously apologised to women who were deceived by him into having sexual relationships. I make those apologies again. These relationships are wrong and abuse of police power and should never have happened. We're committed to learning from the wrongs of the past." It's the key bit here. Can't happen again. And there have been enormous changes made to the training, supervision and legal oversight of undercover officers, both in the Met and nationally. Mark Kennedy and the NPCC declined to comment on this one. Andy, your podcast is doing a very important job here. Where can people hear it? Where can they listen in?
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, you can
Thank
catch
you,
it
Eleanor.
on wherever you get your podcasts, basically.